up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Zamota and Danny Abdeljabbar. What's up, man? How are you?
Chilling, man. As per usual. Long time no podcast.
Yeah, we got to keep on. Don't remind people.
Yeah, we've been a little bit busy. I've been traveling around a lot, and life's been happening. But we've got an interesting episode, I think, for you today. So
yeah, I think so.
Hopefully, it'll make up for the for the loss.
It will be like one of our classic episodes where we used to talk about more so current events and then like tie history back into current events, like the good old days when we used to primarily do episodes on the Middle East.
Mm-hmm. A little bit of military technology sprinkled in, maybe. Who knows?
Yeah. And then we evolved, of course, and took on more complex topics, which took longer to research. But now we're back to our old form, and because there's so much to cover. But first, before we get started, like into the main topic, we need to address it because it's just such big news. It's not really surprising at all. It's like I said before we started recording, it's crazy that this is not crazy. It's crazy that this is so normal, and I think both of us are pretty much unfazed by it. Mm-hmm. But the $95 billion foreign aid package to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan.
Yep.
It's like, you see that imagery of all the congressmen and women raising, waving Ukrainian flags. And I'm just like watching it and I'm like, yeah, this is just kind of normal, isn't it? This is our government.
Somewhat expected, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Just cheering on this war that's going to go on for another year or so now, or prolonging this war for another year. But it's crazy. And the craziest thing to me, and it's not surprising, but I think the whole political landscape is just extremely confused, and most people, I don't think they get the picture. And one of the key people, or someone who's responsible, who was pushing for this behind the scenes, was actually Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. So Donald Trump, he's Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, is allegedly or supposedly was a Trump MAGA Republican, and Trump was allegedly rallying the troops to vote on this, the Republican troops to vote on this. He was working with guys like Lindsey Graham, and the journalist Michael Tracy has a whole article on this that people should read. What I don't understand, well, I do understand it because most people can only think in very binary terms, and they seem to think that the Republican Party, there's like this schism within the Republican Party where you have your establishment and then you got your populist Trumpers, your MAGA movement. Mm-hmm. And it's the establishment guys like Mitt Romney. That's what's wrong with the Republican Party. They're the neocons. They're the ones who are causing all the issues. And people have really failed to realize that the establishment of the GOP is Donald Trump.
Yep.
Is the MAGA wing. That is the establishment. And I'm not saying this in like, the kind of like liberal Trump derangement syndrome perspective. Mm-hmm. I'm saying it as just like looking at reality where
the reality is that
the money
Trump
circuit
is the GOP. Right?
There may have been some bones thrown out to some GOP primary candidates like Nikki Haley and Tim Scott and Ron DeSantis, but obviously none of that really stuck. And none of that worked. Trump's popularity was just completely outweighed everyone. There was just no point of even having a primary almost.
Well, I mean, his daughter-in-law is now the co-chair of the RNC, so it's like, it's super clear.
Yeah, but it's like you have these, and I think a lot of them are kind of well-meaning, where they're like, they think there's this division within the Republican Party where you got your MAGA populists, kind of like old Pat Buchanan types, they're, against the globalist. And they don't realize that the reason why the purse strings and the power surrounding the Republican Party has thoroughly embraced Donald Trump is because Donald Trump has made peace. I think there's been a peace that has been made between Trump and the really, we want to call it the blob or whatever, the deep state, whatever you want to call it, just, the U.S. regime government, the permanent government, what we would call it. There's already been a peace that's been made. And with a Trump presidency, I really doubt there would be any changes in just U.S. foreign policy. It's just the direction it is, and it's the direction that it just is. It's going to continue to go until it does not go anymore, and there will not be at least a Trump that changes it, or probably any elected president who will change the direction of U.S. foreign policy. It is just going the direction it's going. Eventually, it will be unable to sustain itself, and then it will not be able to, then it will stop being what it is. But there's just this weird confusion in this conservative right-wing movement where I think a lot of these people have kind of turned on the Ukraine war, and they've largely turned on it. I don't really think for any type of for moral reasons or for real concerns. It's more or less like it's Joe Biden's war.
Right.
So, we've turned on it. And there's really no indication that if Donald Trump, he may have said some things. And it's funny because liberals think they think the exact same way. They think that a Trump presidency means it's going to be he's going to come in, he's going to become president, and he's going to start cutting. He's going to just completely capitulate to Putin. He's going to leave NATO, and then Europe's going to be conquered by Russia and the bad guys. And he's going to cozy up to Kim Jong-il. That's the narrative that you're hearing from the liberals, which it's the truth is, if he becomes president, and I'm not in the business of forecasting elections because I'm usually wrong, but if he does win the election, I don't think there's going to be many changes in the way policy runs.
Well, and I don't follow right-wing politics closely enough to make a judgment call on your points on the right wing, but I can say that I feel as though that statement is true for any politician. Let's be real. Doesn't matter if Biden wins. Doesn't matter if Trump wins. Doesn't matter if literally any other person takes the presidency. There is a a trend, and the trend has been set, and it doesn't matter who's in that position. It's going to stay roughly the same. However, I will kind of push back a little bit on Trump because he did pull out of the JCPOA, so that was kind of off of the establishment line, I think. So.
Yeah, but he pulled out to serve other interest groups, and that was mainly at the behest of the Israeli lobby. So and now Biden and the Democrats, who I guess one would assume are not, I don't want to say they're not hostile at all, but a little bit more willing to push back on some things. They've essentially let the Israelis do whatever they want. So there's no, it doesn't really matter. It is what it is. There's just this.
Well, in general, there's $95 billion up for grabs right now for the defense of three nations or nationlets. And it sounds like we're going to be in a state of perpetual war for a little while longer. Don't think that the war in Gaza is going to end anytime soon. Don't think that the war in Ukraine is going to end anytime soon. As a matter of fact, I just read recently that Ukraine just did a bunch of strikes deep into Russia recently against some energy and military facilities, partially because of their like newfound, hope, because now they're going to get a bunch of money. Whether or not they would have done those strikes if they didn't get this money, I don't know, different story. Maybe not. Hard to tell, but
yeah, it's hard to tell
that they're doing some deep strikes now that they know that they've got some money coming to them.
It's hard to tell, and there really hasn't been with the Ukraine war. I don't sit down and study maps. I can't read Russian. When people show me like maps of like Ukraine and like territory changes, and then like it's in Cyrillic, I'm like,
right,
dude, I don't know what the fuck
am I looking at?
Like, I don't know what province that is. I know like 6 provinces in Ukraine that I can, or 6 or 7 provinces that I can just tell by location. I don't know what this fucking little town is. Like, I can't read it. Like, I need an analyst who knows what they're doing or who follows it daily to write and explain it to me. But then a lot of the analysts and a lot of the people that I followed at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, who I thought were effectively crystal balls, haven't been. They've been people have been wrong about everything. There's really nobody who's created an accurate assessment about the direction of the war in Ukraine or how it was going to go. Each side has been dominated by kind of like, what each state really wants put out. So it's either the narratives that you get are either, at the beginning it was Russia's going to be in Kiev in 2 weeks. That obviously did not happen. And then the other narrative you get is that Russia lost 1 million soldiers already. That obviously hasn't happened. So, all these geopolitical analysts who are basically just writing to, sycophants to either people who are like super, pro-West or super anti-West. They're just kind of feeding them shit that they want to read.
There's a financial gain in making clickbaity fucking articles these days.
So that's kind of what the situation is, at least in terms of coverage. I couldn't tell you how much longer that war is going to go on. But again, it's going to keep on going on until it doesn't.
It would.
Yeah, the war in Ukraine will go on until it doesn't, until it can't. But then who knows when that date is? But one point,
I'm worried about the same thing for Gaza, though. That shit means all that extra money for Israel just tells me that's going to go on until it doesn't.
the war in Gaza actually is coming to an end. From what I'm
April
reading,
24th at 10:28 p.m. Henry says it's going to end soon.
From what I'm reading, the war in Gaza is wrapping up. There's really nothing else for them to do. Israelis.
Tell me how it wraps up according to what you've read. Just curious. Not even being facetious. I'm legitimately curious.
Well, it's just like just putting everything together from what the U.S. is saying and what the Israelis are saying. They're now talking about getting a Palestinian authority to take control over Gaza, where it would basically be a very similar situation where from the West Bank, where they would get some type of Palestinian authority that works with Israel to provide basic services. However, Israel would of course be responsible for what goes in and out of Gaza in terms of like aid. And a lot of the conversations that are going on right now is really, it's like we have this population that's on the brink of famine, and like that we can't let it go so far where there's just like hundreds of thousands of people who starve to death. So that's really the what's next conversation is happening right now, because the Israelis already destroyed like 70% of the buildings in Gaza. There's really nothing else for them to destroy. A lot of key Hamas guys are like, a lot of the key Hamas guys are gone. Like they're not even in the country anymore, and the rest are, I imagine a lot of them are just pretty much blended into the rest of the population. So what are they going to effectively just continue just murdering people? Like there is a limit to what the rest of the world will stomach. And just the,
I thought we already hit that point a while ago, and it seems like we're still stomaching it.
we did hit that point a while ago, but we've been over the point for weeks, for months now. And I think I said at the beginning of the war, I made a morbid statement, which I think kind of holds true, that the Israelis are going to have like a green light to kill around 20,000 people. And then that's when people are going to be like, okay, you went over 20,000. Well, they're over 33,000 at least.
Right.
Probably at minimum.
That we know about, right.
There's a big chance that when they start pulling bodies out from the rubble, they're going to find a lot more people who are dead, unfortunately. The vast majority of the people who have been killed have not been Hamas militants. they've been
the overwhelming majority is women and children.
70% of the people who have been killed have been either younger than the age of 18 or women.
Right.
So it is, the majority have been women and children who have been killed. And essentially there's basically recognition from the U.S. government what the Israelis are doing is wrong. However, they can't publicly admonish them because from the backlash from the Israel lobby, and it's an election year, so they don't want that. So they've been kind of planting these like little leaks. So like they go to their allies in like the New York Times, and they will be like, "Oh, Biden got into an argument with Netanyahu. He gave him hell," and that's leaked. But the chances are that conversation never happened, or it was like something like, could you imagine Joe Biden like being stern with Netanyahu?
Sure.
Come on, man. Like, it's,
sure, I can imagine it. I just don't think it would be very effective.
Just come on, man. But there's been these leaks, but there is a limit. There's also nothing really else to destroy. So now it's the question is like, how do you get aid into Gaza, which is going to be extremely difficult due to Israeli policy. So that question is not answered. But the other day, both the U.S. and the U.S. made a statement saying that they believe the place for the Palestinians is Gaza, and the Israeli government, the Israelis and the Egyptians agree with us. So it seems that the plan, if there was a plan, to move these people into Egypt will not take place. But there's 1.7 million people there right now. They obviously all can't stay there, so you'd have to.
I just wonder how long it can go on for before they enact this, like wind this down, because like you said, we're brink of famine, right? And they're not, by they I mean Israel, is not really letting in a sufficient amount of foreign aid to help the people that are struggling, the civilians that are struggling. People are going to die very easily, and it's not like they're going to die in several months. It's like they're going to die soon if something isn't done soon, and it doesn't seem like anything's being done soon. And there's still bombings every day,
There's still going to be bombings, but it's not going to be at the scale it was. An Israeli general just recently stepped down, taking responsibility for October 7th, probably, as a political favor to Netanyahu.
If there was a sign if there was a sign that it was winding down, that was it. That's what I would agree with you on. The fact that he stepped down.
Well, and then you just gotta, if you read the Israeli press about last week, there was this big op-ed out of Haaretz saying that Israel is lost, and it's basically an op-ed that's saying that Israel, Haaretz is the oldest newspaper in Israel. It's their center left newspaper. Secular Zionists, but they're more they're critical of the current right-wing government. So they wrote a big op-ed saying how Israel has lost the war and its international standing, and the hostages were not freed. Obviously, most of them were killed at this point.
That's another really good point. Like, how do you get the hostages free? You just,
It's a good chance that a lot of the hostages are dead, unfortunately.
There is a good chance for that, but they still don't know that, right?
The Israelis gunned down 3 of them with a white flag. I mean,
That was just
that was a
3 out
couple
of
of
the few
months ago,
hundred, right?
So, yeah, I mean, the whole thing is a mess. But now that's why.
More importantly, how do you set up a PLO type deal in Gaza right now? Because there's still Hamas there. Yeah, they probably killed the majority of them, but they're still there. And you have an entire population that fucking utterly hates you right now.
Well, the thing is that we don't know how many Hamas guys they got. They could have gotten a lot. Maybe they didn't. But the thing is, though, it's insurgent math. So there's at least 33,000 people who were killed. And you have to times that by what, 10 in terms of their family members who may want revenge. So effectively there could be, 300,000 guys who are willing to join Hamas to get revenge for their son or brother or father or sister or mother who was killed. So,
that's a decent proportion of the existing population, though. 300,000 people out of the 1.7 that remain in Gaza.
I'm not saying, I'm just throwing a number within reason. I'm just saying there's going to be a pissed off young male population who's going to be sympathetic to joining a resistance movement.
Right.
Now, what I'm today is because the speculation is, or some are saying, is that, Benjamin Netanyahu is under a lot of, prior to October 7th, his government was pretty shaky. There had effectively been an Israeli Cold War, over the past year between really, there's kind of like a demographic war going on in Israel, even, without even including the Arabs or the Muslims of the, there's, I'll try to simplify it because it's actually a lot more complex than this, but you have your old school kind of like originating Zionist or Ashkenazi Jews who had been in power for really since the founding of Israel. And then you have a lot of your kind of implants there that are more Middle Eastern or from the Soviet Union who tend to be more right-wing. The power is Netanyahu shares power with some very, very right-wing factions like ultra Orthodox who followed Meir Kahane, who was a designated terrorist in the 1980s. These are groups with that have connections with the person who assassinated Yitzhak Rabin. Like extremist groups are allied with the Netanyahu government, and they try to pull a fast one and change, make judicial reforms that would effectively benefit the ultra Orthodox society.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
So there's been this kind of clash of populations of these demographics in Israel over the past year, and I mean, the last year was kind of like a climax of it with these large million-man protests in Tel Aviv. But it had obviously been going on for a lot longer than that. So Benjamin Netanyahu is incredibly divisive. He's a very polarizing person, not just globally, but within Israel itself. Now, one of the reasons, and this is what I don't think that October 7th was like an inside job or anything like that. I do think that, they genuinely had a big fuck up. I don't think they planned it. However, people are saying that Benjamin Netanyahu is using this to stay in power, and now since the war in Gaza is winding down, he's trying to either provoke a war with Iran or provoke a war with Hezbollah.
Seems like it.
to stay in power, to keep the constant state of emergency. it's interesting because now we're talking about a regional war between Iran, Israel, and the United States, because there's no way that the Israelis could fight Iran on their own. If you look at the drone attack that the Iranians did on Israel, the majority of the drones and missiles that were shot down were not shot down by the Israelis. The majority of them were shot down by,
by us or Jordan,
the United
or
States,
someone else,
the UK, and Jordan.
Mm-hmm.
I think they according to Matt Ho, I think it was about like 60% of the ballistics that were shot down by the United States and the larger coalition that was,
and we
happened there.
And we just happened to be there at that time because of the ongoing Gaza war, right? So it was
well,
convenient
I mean,
for us to have
Iran essentially said that they're going to do it on this date,
yeah,
and you better protect them because we're doing this for theatric reasons, and we don't actually want to kill anyone. We just want to like make a point that you can't kill our generals in our you can't attack our embassies overseas.
Well, taking that back. I mean, like, let's be real. Like,
cross border,
Israel striked, in Syria on an Iranian embassy, and there could be a tactical reason for that, but it just doesn't seem like a good idea, right? If you don't want to provoke a wider war, which really lends a little bit of credence in my eyes to the theory that Netanyahu wants to provoke a wider conflict so that he could stick around, because it just doesn't make sense to me. I mean, here in the United States, we have 170 something embassies from across the world, right? So pretty much almost every country in the world, every recognized UN nation in the world has some embassy or consulate here in the United States, which means that invariably one or more countries that have embassies in the United States hate each other or in active war footing with one another. Could you imagine if one or more of those countries struck a US based embassy? We'd be pissed about that. That would be unacceptable in any way. But it's acceptable for Israel to hit this Syrian, or Iranian embassy in Syria. They're responding to that, and in fact, there was multiple strikes in Syria and other places that were carried out by the Israeli army against the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, by Israel, and they kind of ignored most of them, and this just kind of happened to be that last straw for them. And so they, rightfully so, they were like, all right, well, we can't keep letting you do this, making us look bad. So they very publicly announced that they were going to attack and retaliate. And it was actually a really big, escalation, if you ask me, because this is the first time in the history of post-Iranian revolution that Iran actually directly engages with Israel. Now, before this, it was all through proxies, right? Lebanon and Yemen and other places, Gaza, but never directly. So it's a pretty big escalation, but at the same time, like you said, they gave everybody a heads up. Said, hey, you better protect these people because, we're going to hit you on this day at this time.
Yeah.
They telegraphed it. They made it very, very clear what they were going to do,
Yeah, it was like these slow-moving drones, here they come. It was like the Hindenburg blimps, coming over.
But to this day, Israel hasn't claimed responsibility for the attack on the embassy, nor have they claimed responsibility for the attack on, or the counterattack that happened just recently, where they hit some facilities inside of Iran.
Yeah,
so it's it just appears like I've been reading a lot of articles on this particular situation, and it just appears that the way that I'm seeing it in the news is all we're talking about is Iran attacked Israel, but we're missing the fact that Israel's been with impunity poking at Iran, whether directly or indirectly.
They got them. So the Israelis got Iran pretty good when they attacked that embassy, because they knocked out, they killed, not only did they killed 7 people. Mm-hmm. I think 2 of the guys that they killed were the head guys who,
IGRC commanders. Yeah.
Well, not just not just commanders, but like conduits to Hezbollah, and then a conduit to the Houthis.
Mm.
Those are important people because they're the guys with like, they're the guys who that Hezbollah trusts, that the Houthis trust when they work with Iran. So it's, I mean, those were, I mean, there was a reason why they killed why there was pressure to kill Soleimani. It was because he had all these relationships, and like, you know, Soleimani was kind of like Bismarck in a way, where he had all these like kind of relationships in his head that people didn't even know about, where all these arrangements. You know, that's the reason why that's why those guys were such targets. It was honestly, it was pretty reckless to put them all under one roof when you think about it. Like, even if it is an embassy, the Israelis obviously don't care about bombing any target in Syria with impunity. So,
Yeah.
but what's interesting is I wanted to actually talk about this story because I don't see this being covered at all. No one's really picked this up. But in Syria, there was this big shakeup in their military and intelligence apparatus, and they basically replaced a bunch of their Iran aligned guys with Russian backed guys, because, you know, Syria has basically two primary benefactors, Russia and Iran. Mm-hmm. So they got rid of a lot of the guys who are more, you know, loyal to Iran or who work with Iran, and replaced them with Russian guys, like not actual Russians, but guys who have relationships and who like, you know, go back and forth to Russia. Which is interesting. You know, I don't know exactly what that story tells, but there's some things that you can kind of reasonably speculate.
We're just tired of getting struck by Israel, right?
That's obviously one of them, is where they don't want to get dragged into a war. If there is a war between Iran and Syria, I mean Iran and Israel, they don't want to become the battlefield of that war, because that's, you know, the battlefield would be in Iraq and Syria. So that's one of the reasons, most likely. And from, you know, since I've been following, you know, the situation in, you know, the civil war, the guys, you know, Syria is obviously a country that is predominantly Sunni, despite having a leadership that's essentially a coalition of minorities. So it's like a 30% coalition of minorities rules over, I don't want to say rules over because there's no discriminatory laws against the Sunnis, but it's, you know, the Alawites, the Christians, the Shia, you know, they have a coalition, and they're kind of like the elite whole, you know, they have the key positions in government. Even though Assad's vice president is actually a Sunni woman. But I used to hear that there was a problem with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard guys trying to convert the Sunni Muslims in the Syrian army to Shia Islam, to 12er Shia Islam. And that would cause a lot of issues, like in like the internal ranks. Like there was like some animosity towards that, where you know, they were causing issues to converting people and stuff, because a lot of people in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard are obviously very pious and are very Orthodox Shia. So I used to hear about these tensions. And Syria, like, naturally they wouldn't be an ally with Iran if they didn't have the same enemies. So they're not, I mean, historically, if you want to go back thousands of years, these two regions were allied with each other. But, you know, these are different ethnic groups, Persians and obviously Arabs. They're also, you know, the Ba'ath Party is a secular government. The Iranian Revolutionary Movement is obviously an Islamist movement. So there's not a lot that they actually have in common. And even though that Alawites are technically Shia, the Alawites are you can really separate them from. They're very unique Muslims where they drink. They're very much secularized. Some call them crypto Christians. They're just Christians that they're like Japanese Christians or something, like the Christians that said that they were Muslim but still remained and worshiped Jesus and celebrated Christmas. They just didn't want to convert. So it's they're secularized. They don't practice that same form of 12er Shia in Iran and in Iraq. So there's they're not these natural allies. Also, a lot of the relationship between Iran and Syria, there's it's kind of a predatory relationship.
I mean, all of Iran's
kind of
vassal states are predatory, like that predatory relationships, though.
Yeah, they prefer, the government at least prefers the Russians over Syria. The Russians are over Iran. The Russians obviously being the more powerful country. They don't have as much of a military presence just because they're further away. Mm-hmm. However, they just like working with them more. It's also helps them getting rid of the Iran guys and bringing in more Russian guys. It actually helps them mend wounds with Gulf states. So Syria is right now in the process of normalization between the Arab League. So they're trying to create normal relations with the UAE and Qatar and Saudi Arabia. They're trying to get back into the club. With Iranians kind of meddled in your government, it makes it much harder to do that. And then, of course, the Russians want more control in Syria because, they don't want a regime change. So if there was a war between Israel and Iran, Syria might be the first place to go. That might be the first target to go to do a regime change. And the Russians desperately don't want to lose access to that naval base in Syria. Mm-hmm. So, there's also a lot of Russian investment in Syria as well. Like there's a lot of the Russian finance sector invests in Syrian industry and what's left of their energy sector. So there's that. It's a lot more complex than just like the axis of evil. There's obviously relationships between the states. And then, Iran and Russia are at the same time like tacitly allied with each other as well, even though historically it's never been a precedent where the Persians and the Russians got along. Usually they did not get along. But it's obviously a partnership in convenience.
It's kind of another predatory relationship, if you ask me, because, Iran's making money off of Russians right now by selling them weapons.
Yeah, well, the Russians need those drones.
Right.
They need these cheap drones. So it's complicated. Now, I wanted to talk about Iran a little bit because we're going to talk about like the scenarios of what would happen if there was a war, a wider war that broke out involving Iran, and like what would happen. But I first want to just talk about a little bit more about just like kind of the shitty situation that Iran is currently in. All these states are in. What makes this situation so scary of the outbreak of a regional war is that almost every state that's involved in the region is undergoing like a horrible economic crisis or a horrible political crisis. Like they're all unstable messes. And Iran is in that camp because they're going through, or they are close to suffering through a hyperinflationary spiral. So the rial, which averaged 71,000 to the dollar in 2018, has fallen to 550,000 to the US dollar. So just the inflation has gone up so much in the past 5 years. It's nuts. Just last year alone, it's gone up 40%.
Yeah, we're complaining about like the cost of bread and shit.
And like our, this is leading Iran to consider increasingly, holding risky assets and driving bubbles into stock markets and the housing sector. But the government is just going to get they're caught in a bind because there's these soaring poverty rates, and there's also this deep loss in purchasing power across the population that has the potential to fuel public anger for mishandling the economy. And then in addition to that, there's the Western sanctions that limit oil income and foreign financing and investment. The Iranian government, they use bond sales and privatization to generate revenue, but they also resort to debt monetization, which also adds to the inflationary pressures. So they could end up in a banking crisis, just like how Lebanon was a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. Iran also has other problems as well, like that you don't think about as much. There's like really bad water stress. Like I read this, I forgot where I read this, but it was something credible. It was something from like the UN, where 70% of the population lives in like water. They suffer from extreme water stress, mm-hmm. which is a hell of a lot of people.
Yeah. They've got a huge population. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's about 80 million people who live in Iran. So millions of people live in water stress areas. Then there's there's just like they're earthquake prone.
Yeah. Remember the earthquakes bit for later. It's going to be important.
They're completely dependent right now on high oil prices. So if the price of oil drops, that would be a major pitfall for the economy.
Yep.
And then they have all these separatist movements in Iran as well that potentially can serve as, or they actually do serve as, fifth columns. Like when there's a Iranian scientist who gets killed or assassinated, like it's, not, the Israelis aren't sending some like secret spy agent to go kill them. It's, they have groups that they work with.
People embedded in Iran.
There's people embedded that work with the Israelis and the United States to take out the targets that they want. So, and this is like, there's Kurdish groups in there. There's Kurdish separatist groups. There's Arab separatist movements. There's Balaki separatist movements. There's Azeri movements. And then you have just like your liberals, your kind of younger
fucking liberals. They're fucking everything up everywhere, huh?
They're the least of their problems, honestly, in terms of the ones who are the liberal protests. They go on for a couple of months and then they kind of settle down. Usually they're kind of female focused. They'll be advocating for things like women's rights because Iran is a theocratic society. It is oppressive there.
The liberals aren't creating situations where they're fighting Pakistan, as an example, like the Balochi separatist movements are.
Yeah, they're not. Yeah, they're not.
They're not creating like regional issues.
The liberals aren't going. They're not grabbing guns and shooting people or blowing up terrorists. What was it? Khatib was it? Not Khatib Hezbollah. ISIS-K. Weren't they responsible for the? Was it ISIS-K or was it Al-Qaeda who was responsible for that terrorist attack a couple of months ago that killed around 100 people?
I don't remember, man. I
don't fucking remember which one it was. I think it was ISIS-K. I mean, we did a whole episode on ISIS-K. I mean, they're based out of Pakistan, and they're basically Pashtun refugees who kind of took the banner of ISIS. However, we don't know. I mean, that ISIS-K was the same group that killed the American Marines and naval officers who were evacuating those, who were assisting with the evacuation of Kabul. So there's all sorts of reasons why there's terror in Iran. Ranging from separatist, nationalist movements to liberal groups that are advocating for social change, or just people who are pissed off at the economic situation. So it's not a stable government right now. I mean, it's an oppressive government. So they do, as of now, they have a kind of a strong grip on society, but you never know when that's going to loosen. What strengthens that the most is its opposition to Israel, because that's like one thing that a lot of them can unite on. Mm-hmm. That's when they kind of revert and follow the strong man. But then you have your MEK, which we're not going to get too much. I think we may do an episode on MEK down the road. MEK is like the primary group that the Israelis use to assassinate, nuclear scientists. They're like a real strange Islamic. They're a Marxist Islamic group. They're currently based out of Albania. They've been exiled, obviously, out of Iran, but they used to work with Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq War, and they would, carry out assassinations and bombings in Iran. They were a terror group. They were a dedicated terror group from the United States, and up until like around 2013, right around the start of the Syrian civil war. Then they were taken off the group because they became more of a political group, but they still have a militant wing. But they're like a strange group. They're like ran by this this couple, and like they all live like Scientologists, where they're not allowed to like talk to people outside of their community, and there's like exiles. It's like super weird. It's like a giant Scientology death cult, Islamic Marxist death cult. But not to digress, we're going to talk about the scenarios between, like, what would a war actually look like? Because we went over, there's obviously these big weaknesses in Iran. There's obviously a lot of political problems going on in Israel. There's even political problems going on in the U.S. But despite that, Iran is this humongous country. So even if there was like this political will to go invade Iran, it's not something that's obviously easy, because it's a huge country. I mean, it's just as the topography is just as crazy as it was in Afghanistan, but we're now dealing with a much larger population, a much better armed population, or a much, I wouldn't say better armed population, a much stronger military that has, ballistic missiles and hypersonic missiles.
Right. The Taliban didn't have hypersonic missiles.
Yeah, they did not have.
Not even close.
They did not have that type of stuff. So, maybe you can introduce the Millennium Challenge.
Yeah. I mean, all of this is kind of just brings us back to the Millennium Challenge, because I think when you're thinking about situations where, the West is going to war with Iran, whether that's the U.S. directly or, through proxies like Israel or something like that, you always got to think about how would that go down. And there was actually an exercise that the U.S. did back in 2002 called the Millennium Challenge, or MCO2, which was a large-scale war game that was designed to basically transition the U.S. military from, Cold War strategies to modern technology-driven tactics, which was a big reflection of the shift in global military changes after 9/11. And it was held between the Afghanistan invasion and the Iraq war, and it was basically intended to test a bunch of new military strategies under these, quote, realistic conditions, and specifically against what they would consider a technologically inferior but kind of strategically adept enemy. And that enemy was modeled closely on on a Middle Eastern military force like Iraq or Iran. But there's a lot of debate about whether or not it was Iran or not. Personally, Henry and I are fully convinced that it is, that they totally modeled it on that. There are some people who seem to make claims that it might have been modeled after Turkey. I could see where they're saying on that one. I'll get to that later. And then I was reading Reddit and I found someone who was trying to make the argument that the MC02 was based on like Israel being the belligerent. And I was like, that makes no sense. In general, though, a lot of these military games, they never clearly name the adversary, right? They just say random country in the middle of the Middle East, near the Persian Gulf, right? And that's all they say.
Yeah, they'll say like Danny Sherson said that he did a military game where it was Nagorno-Karabakh, but they didn't say like the actual countries. It was just that's the region where it took place. Right.
It's like, who else are you fighting?
Yeah, so it's like, okay, Azerbaijan and Armenia. It's like, no, we didn't go that far. That's the region. We're not saying it's Armenia.
We're not saying it was Azerbaijan. We're not saying it was that, but it definitely was in the Nagorno-Karabakh region. Yeah. Anyway, MC02 was just a landmark U.S. military simulation, and it's often cited as the most elaborate and ambitious and just straight up downright expensive concept development exercise in American history. And it was sponsored by the now dissolved U.S. Joint Forces Command, or JFCOM. And it cost $250 million to do this exercise. It's $250 million, which is, of course, more than some countries spend or even have for their entire military budget. But I digress. It also involved 13,500 personnel across multiple locations. So basically, it's this absolutely massive war game which pitted two sides against each other. And those sides were a red team versus a blue team, where the red team was this nameless adversary, which we're going to say is definitely Iran, and the blue team, which is the U.S. Following so far?
Yes.
Cool. Now, we actually did an episode on this, and it was like episode 86, and we're up to 300 whatever now, and there's going to be a lot of overlap with that episode, but I don't even think it's available anymore. I think we might have taken it down. So yeah, I'm going to venture a guess and say that a lot of this is going to be new content for most of the people that listen today. So we're just going to go right in, but I actually found a bunch of new stuff too, so I think this is going to be pretty interesting to talk about and think about. Anywho, so there's this whole background story to the war game. And every war game is set up with like some kind of background story. It's not just like a random exercise. Like they give everyone a role and they give them like personas and things like that. And the background to this war game sounds like the plot to a Call of Duty game. So the story goes, a rogue military commander broke away from his government somewhere in the Persian Gulf after an earthquake. That's the earthquake part that I wanted you to remember. And he was threatening to engulf the entire region into war, and had this pretty big power base, and came from a strong religious and ethnic sect, and was harboring and sponsoring a bunch of different terrorist organizations, and was, of course, highly anti-American, or highly anti-blue, as they would say. And here's some select quotes from the actual U.S. Joint Forces Command Millennium Challenge Experiment Report, which is like 752 pages. I didn't read it all, of course. That's just way too much work. But I found a bunch of interesting stuff out of it. So here's what they said about the adaptive adversary. The MC02 opposing forces, or OP4, mission was to be credible adversary for the Blue Force. This required OP4 that was an aggressive, adaptive, capable of achieving its own objectives through diplomatic, information, military, and economic influences. The senior OP4 leadership team included a retired general USMC who was the JTF South commander, and a former U.S. ambassador, the GOR supreme leader. The MCO2 scenario called for an upper-level, small-scale contingency. As such, the OPFOR organized into a multifaceted group that included the government, the military, a terrorist organization, pirate organization, blah, blah, blah. So it's just like the red team was a bunch of smaller groups that kind of just made up one larger whole. And these elements had their own objectives, which did not always work cooperatively. As such, they posed a considerable challenge for the Blue JTF. So here's the scenario that they put forth. The MC02 scenario postulated a year 2007 regional power, Red. They're called Red. Situated within an area of critical world strategic and economic importance. Later on, they point out that it was close to the Persian Gulf. Red suffered a natural disaster, an earthquake, and the subsequent chain of events resulted in a separation of rogue military commander, identified as the CGTF South. He and his subordinate military commander spun away from the national government, or the government of Red, control. A renegade element within the Red leadership, CTFJ, conducted broad actions including conventional military, asymmetric, diplomatic, informational, economic, terrorist applications, blah, blah, blah. So that was the setup for this scenario. And there's like a bunch of other interesting data points, like parts of the scenario says that like the government of Red, the original government, was not like they were not a on the books supporter of terrorism, but like in the background they were supporting terrorist groups, kind of like in a clandestine way. They made a lot of assumptions on, you know, what either side could do. So neither Blue or Red could use weapons of mass destruction during the scenario. They wouldn't allow an escalation into like a major theater war, like, so it's not going to turn into World War III. And a couple of other somewhat reasonable restraints, including that the entire exercise had to be completed within 48 hours after the arrival. For OPFOR, or for the Red team, they were allowed to operate, quote, freely within the constraints of the scenario, and they would be able to maintain communications, including electronic and non-standard stuff like couriers, smoke flags, and religious sermons, things like that. We'll get into more of that later. So basically, they set up this scenario, and it's intended to give this idea that there's some kind of catastrophe in this region, and now we got to step in and make sure that there's stability in that region. So they set up a bunch of different missions for each of the teams. So for example, in the war games, some of the Blues team's mission were to secure the shipping lanes for international commerce, neutralize the WME, or weapons of mass of, So WME is weapons of mass effect. So not quite mass destruction, but mass effect. Establish sovereign control of the disputed islands. So there's some islands that were in disputed control, which is where I think people are trying to say that this is Turkey because of, I guess, Cyprus, or like the areas around Cyprus. That's the only thing that I latch onto for it being maybe Turkey, but I don't know. I doubt that we're setting up war games that cost $250 million against a potential NATO target. That just doesn't seem to make sense.
Hey, well, what if there was an earthquake like there was in Turkey just 2 years ago, and like the Erdogan government collapsed, and then some crazy took power, like some like crazy
maybe, but
separatist.
It's probably more likely that would happen in Iran.
It's more likely it would happen in Iran, but hey, Turkey has its own ethnic strife and issues.
Sure.
And this
is literally the only thing that makes me feel like it might be it. Just this one line about disputed islands, you know? That's it. Other than that, it seems to line up much more clearly with Iran. Anywho, so the Red Team's mission, so the bad guys, Iran's missions, were slightly more complicated because the Red Team was, like I said, wasn't exactly a single cohesive team. it was 3 primary red groups that opposed the blue team, and they didn't always cooperate. So a couple of quotes here. Op 4 consisted of 3 primary elements: JTF military forces, the government of red, national leadership, and a terrorist organization that included some pirates, a private company, and criminal elements. So the JTF South objectives were to preserve the regime, deter blue military deployment, limit blue war aims, and restore internal cohesion. They also had to reduce blue presence in the region, develop regional influence, and get a speedy economic recovery in the aftermath of the earthquake. Also, control Western access to natural resources, like oil, and gain red stature. The GOR, or the government entity, the original government entity, all of their objectives was to get rid of the blues and also keep their regime. That was basically their jobs. And then the terrorists' objectives were to deny blue access to the region, attack opposing political and religious organizations, including ones from the original government, and disrupt blue operations. So they were kind of the wild card in that situation. Anyhow, in this scenario, like, we understood the mission and the objectives. An interesting aspect of these war games, though, is how they remind me of like generals kind of sitting around a table, almost like they're playing Dungeons and Dragons. It's important to note that besides the red and the blue teams, there was also a white cell. So think of like the white cell as the dungeon master in a role-playing game. And the commander of the white cell was JFCOM or JIFCOM. And he was Commander Buck Kernan, who had a honestly pretty dope name. So he was basically the dungeon master, and he was responsible for setting up all of these scenarios and making sure that the game adhered to the rules of free play. And he also made sure that nobody was bending any of the rules with like some absurd moves. On the red team, we had retired Marine Corps 3-star General Paul Van Riper, and he had been retired for a few years before being brought back because of his experience in previous war games. And lastly, the blue team commander was Army Lieutenant General B.B. Bell, and those were the key main players in this game. I figured maybe we can dive into like some of the things that actually went down, which were particularly interesting. So starting with the blue team, they had some specific objectives in mind, and they were aiming to validate changing military doctrines, right? So the Pentagon at this time was realizing that traditional warfare involving like tank battles and trench warfare, that was becoming totally obsolete. Remember, we're talking about 2002 years, 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago. And the planning for this started well before that. So the notion of engaging in these protracted battles with like tanks and stuff like that was at the time totally being reconsidered. And they acknowledged that no military on the planet could match the U.S. war machine in a direct confrontation. And as a result of that conclusion, they figured that the future conflicts would be more like insurgencies that affected societal habits more profoundly than just territorial conflicts. And those war games involved a significant computer simulation component, and that they wanted to test out. So basically, these military decisions were put into the system by the white cell, by Kernan, which would then produce an outcome based on the input. You could think of this as like rolling the dice, right? The computer, you'd say, I'm going to do this thing, and then roll the dice and see if you get I've never played Dungeons and Dragons before, so I don't know how those nerds.
I actually just started playing Dungeons and Dragons.
Nerd.
Well, not literally through the board game. I'm not that much of a dork, but there used to be a Dungeons and Dragons place like next to my old apartment.
Oh yeah.
And I used to like look in there, and I used to not make fun of them. I used to feel envy. I'd be like, I'm actually kind of jealous. I'm like, these guys look like they're having so much fun. Like, I wish I played Dungeons and Dragons and had some nerdy friends who would play this game with me. All my friends would just viciously make fun of me if I started doing that. But through Baldur's Gate,
Oh yeah, I guess you're right. Yeah,
That
yeah,
that
yeah,
actually has Dungeons and Dragons rules in the game.
yeah. Totally.
So I technically have started playing it, but
Okay, you're less of a dork than I thought. Um, so yeah, so basically they're using these computer systems that were producing outcomes, and they wanted to test to see if that would be, if that would work in real scenarios. And the blue team used various predictive algorithms to test out these tactics, right? And this highly like computerized method, they were trying to figure out, could we use predictive algorithms that could, help with things like the fog of war, right? And additionally, there was a substantial, and this is, I think, probably the part that cost the most money. There was a substantial, like, live fire component where there were actual troops executing maneuvers in real places, and this was to test the viability of these new strategies, not just like in theory, but in like a practical, real world setting. So the early stages of this war game involved controlling like key shipping lanes and moving forces rapidly, and this approach unexpectedly shifted the dynamics of the entire game. The emphasis was on these live fire exercise. That was basically a directive from Congress. They actually mandated that these exercises were live fire to assess whether or not the U.S.'s lethality was on par, and they were looking to enhance those wartime capabilities. So that was a directive from Congress to do that. And on the first day, the blue team deployed a substantial naval force, and I'm talking about not just an aircraft carrier, but like a complete battle group. The group included amphibious assault vehicles, battleships, other heavily armed ships, totaling more than 10 vessels. And that battle group positioned itself off the coast of the red team's fictional country. In this case, it was, in the Persian Gulf. And they deployed tens of thousands of troops. And then the blue team then presented the red team with an 8-point ultimatum, with the final point being surrender. Now, General Riper on the red team understood that, his theoretical country's political leaders would reject those terms. He figured that, the blue forces would not only intervene directly, but they're probably going to launch a preemptive strike. And, this strategy reflects the Bush doctrine, which advocates for preemptive strikes as a defensive measure against like an imminent or perceived future threat to the U.S. But General Van Riper is also commander in the U.S. Army, so he understands this, right? And he thinks, all right, well, the only way that he's going to have any survival against the blue team is if he hits first. And so one thing that the blue team does is strategically disables his microwave towers and cut his fiber optic lines. And the reason why they did that was to force Van Riper's forces to rely on radio communication, which the U.S. could easily monitor. And understanding these tactics, Van Riper basically adapted. He bypassed all the electronic communication altogether. He instead opted for using motorcycle couriers to relay messages. I'll have a bit more to say on this a little bit later, but basically the method ensured that his strategies, remained undetected by the team surveillance. He also used some other creative communication methods. One notably was the adhan, the Muslim call to prayer that gets broadcast over loudspeakers 5 times a day, and basically he figured out a way to encode messages within those calls to coordinate different military actions discreetly. And he also did this thing where he manipulated light patterns on airfield runways as another way of communicating, which was interesting. And all of these, tactics were just like nice call outs to Van Riper's ability to adapt and communicate. And, he was total badass and things like that. But it's important to recognize that these methods don't necessarily require genius level intellect to develop. Van Riper was obviously a highly educated and intelligent individual. He was respected as an academic among generals. He served in Vietnam, and a lot of the officers in Vietnam ended up, becoming academics and developed practical approaches to military strategy. And Van Riper himself was a perfect example of that. But when you consider a country like Iran, which has faced severe sanctions from the U.S. and underwent catastrophic wars, it's plausible that Iranian commanders themselves would also develop similar innovative strategies if they were put in this position. I mean, the IRGC, are known as an elite fighting force in the Middle East military landscape, and they'd be more than capable of devising these kind of comparable tactics. At least I think so. But ultimately, the blue team was, I think, overconfident in their approach. They thought they had a strategic, advantage, and that they cornered the red team by cutting off their communications, and they thought that they were just going to overpower and take control, and they underestimated the potential for some interesting strategies from the red team. And Van Riper, who was, as I said before, pretty smart, he analyzed the capability of the blue team's military vessels, and he figured out that their Aegis anti-missile systems were pretty good at intercepting incoming threats, but that all of those systems had a finite capacity to handle simultaneous attacks. And so he crunched the numbers and determined, what is the upper limit that these anti-missile systems could handle? And when the blue team reached a point where they couldn't retreat safely, Van Riper basically executed a massive missile barrage. And his forces used ground-based launchers, but notably he also concealed a lot of launchers in commercial shipping vessels. And additionally, Van Riper used another pretty daring strategy, which involved flying aircraft at really low altitudes to evade radar detection. He used boats that were loaded with explosive and suicide missions that were aimed at the blue team's ships. Basically, this multifaceted approach led to Van Riper sinking 19 U.S. ships, including an aircraft carrier, several cruisers, and other vessels. And the entire encounter, by Van Riper's account, was over in 10 minutes. And he basically won. And the next day, Van Riper escalated these tactics by, putting a small fleet of boats in the Persian Gulf, initially for reconnaissance, and then without warning, the fleet launched another attack, which significantly impacted the U.S. naval forces from the previous day. And, it was pretty crazy. I mean, he just launches a barrage of missiles to overwhelm everything. And you would think that the game would be over at that point, but the response from the blue team was basically they asked Kernan from the white cell to respawn the ships. So they got a do-over. And despite this tactical win that Van Riper had, the structured military exercises, they're very expensive. They had to proceed as planned. There's a sunk cost to all of this giant military exercises, meaning that these games had to keep going, even though the blue team technically lost. And this is where I think I was a bit overly critical last time when we first talked about this topic, many years ago, almost 5 years ago now. And after reading more about it and reading through the actual reports, it was clear that winning, which was still important, wasn't the exact main goal of all this. Even losing here helped the U.S. military learn something. And continuing the exercise wasn't just an exercise to not waste money, but also taking an opportunity to train on these systems. I don't know, imagine you're a soldier that gets deployed on one of these ships for this exercise, and 5 minutes in, Van Riper sinks your ship, and you're, quote, dead, right? Sucks for you. Now you can't train, or whatever it was that you were supposed to do, right? And that's just not an acceptable outcome for these types of war games. You're not going to not train this soldier because, Van Riper's a genius, So, of course, resetting made sense.
Yeah, it wasn't some nefarious cover up where it's oh, we lost the war game and we need to shut this up and just pretend like we won. It makes sense.
I mean, don't get me wrong, there was still a bunch of shit that made no sense, right?
Yeah.
So for example, after they respawned all the ships, and that's fucking crazy. And then Van Riper gets pissed, and I think within a day or so he pulls out, but continues to be one of the advisors. But he was just kind of pissed off at it, at the whole situation. And Kernan and the White Cell basically started altering the rules of the game after this point to curb Van Riper's successful strategies. One of them, which is pretty interesting looking back now, was allowing the blue team to use V-22 Osprey aircraft, which, if you're not familiar with the Osprey, it's a military aircraft. It looks like what would happen when a airplane and a helicopter have a baby. It's basically a tilt rotor aircraft. It allows for large troop and equipment transport. Interesting looking plane. But what's interesting about this in particular is that in 2002, Ospreys were still being developed, right? And they weren't introduced until 2007, right? Like in actuality. So technically speaking, the war game was set in 2007. So I guess allowing the use of an unreleased weapon that would be released in that time period is fair game, right? Kind of. But at the time, the Osprey program was over budget and overdue, which, in my opinion, that means that there was no guarantee that it would have been available in 2007. And also, looking back almost 20 years later on this Osprey, that thing is fucking dangerous for everyone who pilots them and anyone who goes inside of them. They've been like literally falling out of the sky for years now. Like we make fun of the F-35 for falling out of the sky. Like this plane actively kills people. And that's something that they didn't know about back in 2002, which, I mean, would have been an important thing to know. I don't think they would have used as many Ospreys in this exercise as they did if they would have known that these things were such death traps. But again, the point isn't exactly to win, but to test out new theories and train. So we'll give them a pass on the Osprey. Well, here's the thing. Van Riper was aware that the blue team was going to use the Osprey aircraft, and he also knew that that aircraft has a pretty significant radar cross-section, which means they're very easy to see with radar. They're not stealthy. And despite their size and the obvious ability for people to see them with radar, or even their own eyes, Kernan put restrictions on targeting them. So he specifically prohibited the use of radar against the Ospreys, and he even barred firing at them during the troop deployment, which means that during this exercise, nobody was allowed to shoot the Ospreys. And obviously that's kind of frustrating because it's absurd to have this like airplane that's super vulnerable flying around that you can't engage with, right? And to make the issue worse, Van Riper was like, okay, cool, I won't shoot the airplanes, but could I use chemical weapons against the troops once they land? Which chemical weapons was within his simulated arsenal. He had that in his arsenal, and he was also denied that option as well. So basically, all of these restrictions that were placed on the red team after the red team won that initial bout, led to a whole lot of criticisms about the exercise being unrealistic, which it was. It was entirely unrealistic. I mean, it's understandable to an extent, I think, to respawn the ships and, make up some unrealistic conditions so as not to waste money and still have the ability to train. But I think that line, in my opinion, gets crossed way too much for this exercise. This approach seemed to basically undermine the authenticity and the strategic value of the simulation itself. What's the point of training if what you're going to train on is not real? It's like totally unreal. I feel like if
they're training on the assumption that won't actually happen.
Yeah, won't ever happen, right? It'd be like a basketball player training to swing a golf club. Like that doesn't happen in basketball, and it will never happen in basketball, So it's weird.
It would be interesting. I mean, it wouldn't be interesting. It would be horrible, but if there was, I mean, these are tactics that Iran would allegedly use in a fight, really in like the Strait of Hormuz, right? Like that's what we're talking about.
Yep.
I wonder how much. I mean, because they're more sophisticated now than their military is more sophisticated now than it was in 2007 or no 2004 when this took place, right?
Two, yeah.
Oh, 2002 when this took place.
Yeah, I mean it's much more sophisticated, and I'd like to get into some ways that looking at the Millennium Challenge today makes sense. But just to wrap up the Millennium Challenge here, pretty much like 10 years after it happened, they released a 752-page report in 2012, which I've quoted extensively today. And that report acknowledged that the blue team was caught off guard because they were relying on some outdated strategies that Van Riper was familiar with. And it was also admitted that the idea that the blue team was superior using advanced technology that wasn't even available at the time, and that also that the parameters of the exercise were heavily skewed in blue team's favor. So it's not even that this isn't a secret, right? Like everyone knew, including in the actual report that they wrote, everyone knew that this was weird and that it was scripted basically at the end. And it revealed that even though the conditions were scripted to a blue team victory, the outcome was basically manipulated, and that's pretty critical because it highlighted the need for more realistic and unscripted military exercises. But I want to be fair to this, and this is something that we didn't talk about the first time we talked about the Millennium Challenge. There has been criticisms on Van Riper's part as well. So remember the motorcycle couriers to get around, him not having communication networks? Well, apparently he was evidently sending these messages as if he was allowed to do this motorcycle courier thing, but he was using them and treating them as if motorcycles were just as efficient as electronic communication networks, which isn't real, right? So basically, his communications would have no lag time. I think I read somewhere on Reddit that they were joking about it, saying like it was called light speed motorcycles. Like everything, all of the information was moving at the speed of light, basically. And then clearly,
Iran has hypersonic missiles. Why not have light speed
motorcycles? Yeah. Also, here's another interesting one. The how Van Riper supposedly destroyed the U.S. fleet with swarm tactics. So trying to do that isn't unreasonable, and I think anyone who studies this would probably agree that Iran would do something similar. And actually evaluating these tactics is kind of like the whole point of the war game anyway, so that was fine. The trouble wasn't that Van Riper got too creative for the computer model. The trouble was that the observer controllers failed to put some reasonable restrictions on Van Riper early on. So specifically, the type of missiles that he used aren't small, and you need a fairly big ship to launch them from. The problem is that Van Riper basically strapped this big rocket system onto tiny little boats that couldn't have reasonably fit them on them and still remain like seaworthy. So that was like super unrealistic. He also took advantage of the limited operational boundaries of the war game, which basically means like blue team was restricted to this one specific area, but red team wasn't necessarily. And he used that to get his swarm fleet to get to this point blank range with the carrier strike group without actually having to cross any distances. So you could argue that what Van Riper did was less outsmarting the U.S. military and more just outsmarting the boundaries of the game itself. So just trying to be fair here, there was some shit that Van Riper did that was kind of not real. However, I think today, more than 20 years later, there are actually lots of examples of real asynchronous warfare tactics like this Millennium Challenge that have been used that are really similar to what Van Riper did. And I was hoping, at this point, I can stop talking so much and we could just have a chat about some of those things, that have happened today. I mean, the one that's pretty top of mind right now is, the Hamas attack on October the 7th. They used swarm rocket fire. And as we saw, many of them were intercepted, but not all of them. We also kind of became familiar with the economics of it all, right? The Iron Dome rockets are what, 20,000 a piece? And it cost what, a couple $100 to make a Hamas rocket? So like, how long can you hold that up,
I think the Iron Dome rockets are more than $20,000 a piece. Well, what Iran did with that drone / missile attack is that they were using the drones to overwhelm the Iron Dome so they could sneak in missiles. So they didn't do any real. They hit an airfield, but they didn't kill anyone. Obviously, they caused some damage to the airfield. But what they would do if they were, let's just say if they were going to attack Israel, what they would probably do is that they would have like, thousands of these cheap drones,
Right.
and then they would sneak in missiles. They would sneak in, they would sneak
Some
missiles in,
hypersonics and stuff. Yep.
yeah, hypersonic stuff, and then probably, they would. I don't think they would do it unless Hezbollah was going to join them as well.
Right.
And Hezbollah
To add to the overwhelming barrage. Right?
Yeah, to add to the overwhelming barrage, and then who knows, maybe the Houthis contribute as well, but I don't know how much. I don't know, like, realistically how much they can actually get over. Like, how much, most of the stuff the Houthis send over is shot down by U.S. naval ships before they, get anywhere close to Israel.
Yeah, well, that's because we're loitering there, but
Yeah, but they wouldn't. I mean, I don't think the Houthis wouldn't make that. The Houthis aren't stacked or on the border of Israel at the very
Right,
least.
they're
Maybe
not
if they
close
were on the
enough, yeah.
border.
But I mean, even with the response, right? Israel's attack on Iran, right? And I was reading about this earlier. They were using beyond visual range missile systems from airplanes. So basically, they were hundreds of miles outside of Iran. They didn't have to cross into Iranian airspace, and they shot these missiles from air platforms. And what they were doing was they were using drones, swarms of drones, to distract a lot of these conventional anti-air systems. So they basically did the same thing right back to Iran. So
In their retaliation strike.
correct.
Okay.
And now in both of these cases, the attack on the attack on Israel from Iran and the attack in Iran from Israel, they weren't actually intending to kill each other or like do major damage. It was more like symbolic or, fucking saber rattling. But they did prove that these types of tactics would be deployed in, 2010 plus warfare. And they did prove that it's useful. It works. Another couple of things that I'd like to talk about is Russia-Ukraine. I'm going to stretch a little bit here because obviously Millennium Challenge wasn't talking about Russia and Ukraine. But something that we can take from it is the kind of disparity between the two forces. Right? In the Millennium Challenge, we had the U.S., which was an overwhelming military power against a inferior, Middle Eastern country power. And the same kind of idea was just like the Russian initial attack on Ukraine. And I think, there were many people that were suggesting that it was going to be an overwhelming win for Russia, and it just wasn't. I mean, to this day, they're still going at it. Now, Ukraine just recently has been attacking Russian fleets, and they've been using drones, underwater drones, cheap-made rockets, and also lots of premium Western arms to take down Russian ships. And so what we see here is the use of asymmetrical warfare from an inferior military power against what would be presumed as a world superpower. It really makes you think, like, are we really that strong anymore?
Well,
I mean, HIMARS, man-pads, and cheap, rockets have been good enough to defend against whole armored Russian columns. And then we've had conversations with Joseph Solis-Mullen about China, right? And we talked at length about Chinese anti-ship missiles, which have ranges that go beyond the operating ranges of carrier flight missions. What that means is their missiles can fly farther than our airplanes can fly round trip from an aircraft carrier. And that means that we have to keep our ships farther and farther away from China, which means are these giant, aircraft carriers just sitting ducks?
it's why I don't think the United States wants a war with Iran. Is because a confrontation will lead to a controversial amount of American casualties.
Agreed.
And even if like, because I think what would happen if there was an actual war, the U.S. would do the whole routine of like attacking nuclear sites, but
Mm-hmm.
it's like, how do you even get these sites? They're all underground or in mountains. Then it would just be purely an economic war. So they would probably, maybe they try to secure the Strait of Hormuz or something, just to
I don't know,
secure.
that's within striking range of those
Yeah,
of literally the scenario of
yeah.
the
So that
MCO2.
so that would be shut down. I guess they would be. I mean, where can they blockade
I don't
Iran?
think there's a good option here, man. I think
There's
it's weapons of mass destruction is the one obvious answer, which I hope is never used ever again. The other option is you just don't fight. you know?
Yeah, it's a war of. I feel like Israel and Iran are just playing the waiting, like the civilizational collapsing waiting game.
See who like gives up first. Yeah.
What society is going to like change or crumble or implode would be a better word
Mm-hmm.
for it. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, right now seems like Iran is on a faster track of imploding given their financial crisis, but we didn't really talk about a lot of the problems that Israel's having. I mean, we did, but there's more than just like the global political reputation. They're also going through their own financial problems because of the war.
Correct. And there's a reason why we're giving them billions of dollars in
Yeah,
aid. Right.
and Israel's a very small. I mean, it's Dennis Prager's like, why do you care so much about this tiny, tiny country? Israel
Prager,
is
you.
so small. It's such a tiny, tiny country. Why are you obsessed with it? Um, but Israel is a small country, so it's it's what was the point I was trying to make right here?
I guess like its economy isn't so bolsterous that it could survive a long, protracted war on its own.
Well, it just doesn't have the manpower
Mm-hmm.
to survive a long, protracted war. Like it would just require the United States. Like the United States would have to
It would
project
have to
that
step in.
power abroad on its behalf. At least
Well,
if
fun.
it was, putting like naval ships or the Israeli Air Force could do damage,
Mm-hmm.
but they don't. The IDF isn't capable of really invading anything other than like Gaza. Like I don't think the IDF is capable of invading Lebanon. Again, I mean, last time they tried to invade Lebanon, they were pushed out,
Yep.
and Hezbollah wasn't nearly as strong as it is now than it was back then. Like I mean, it's way stronger now than it was back in 2000, in the early 2000s. So, it's really just all dependent on the U.S. But the good news is that as corrupt as our government is, and they're not insane to the point of like they understand that there's some lines that you can't cross
Mm-hmm.
because there are consequences that they have to suffer. And a war with Iran, like just imagine if the U.S. went into just decided, all right, fuck it, we're going to change that government by any means necessary. We're going to, you know, launch a naval attack in the Strait of Hormuz, and then we're going to launch an invasion from Iraq, and then we're going to launch an invasion from Afghanistan, and then our plan is to topple the government. I mean, that would just be impossible. Like, you couldn't. We wouldn't be. Maybe it's possible. It is probably possible. I mean, the U.S. war machine is still the U.S. war machine, but it wouldn't be possible without tens of thousands of casualties.
Yeah.
And we don't have the state of mind to deal with that as a country. You know, back then, when guys did do this, it was just, you know, do I need to go to Korea and kill some communists? Yeah, sure. I mean, may I die? I mean, that was the mentality. It's like, yeah, I'll go to Korea and 50,000 American soldiers were killed in Korea.
It's too many people. Mm-hmm.
Well, it's too many people, but it was just within a pretty small period of time, and everyone was able to stomach it. Now we couldn't do that. Societies.
I think people aren't able to stomach it anymore, because back in the day it was just like, where else were you getting this news? You know?
Yeah. Also,
it's just so obvious now. I can watch a video right now if I wanted to, of like people being blown up in any corner of the globe. You know, wild.
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons why people are a lot more casualty adverse. People had harder lives back then too.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, you know, a lot of guys who volunteered for the military. It's like a sense of purpose. It's better than working in a factory, better than working on the farm. You get to serve your country, and it's like, you know, these aren't just like military escapades. These are the wars of the century. These are the wars of good versus evil that we're joining. You know, so it's a different mindset. But it is turning past midnight, so I think it's time to wrap this episode up, because my voice is also dying.
For sure.
Thanks, guys, for listening to another episode of Bro History. If you want to support the show, rate and review the podcast on your Spotify, on your Apple Podcast, and then on YouTube. So we were on Google Podcast, and now we're on, I guess it transformed into YouTube, right?
Yep. YouTube Music.
So I actually have YouTube Music. That's where I listen to all my stuff. So if you have YouTube Music, or if you use Google Podcast, it's on YouTube Music now. And then you can also support our Patreon. Anything that you would like to add?
Nope.
All right. Peace, guys.
Peace.